What do you do when the dream that you feel that God has given you seems impossible? You remember when you were younger and you had a hope for your life. You had a vision for how your life would go. Maybe you even thought God was leading you towards something, an incredible marriage, a career that mattered, a life full of purpose. But then something happened, and it feels like the door has been slammed shut. You thought you'd be happily married by now, but you're not. You thought that job was finally the break you needed, but it wasn't. You thought that if you could just step out in faith and believe that God had a plan, but now it sure doesn't look like it. And the hardest part is that you did everything right. You prayed, you trusted, you waited, but instead of an open door, all you see are roadblocks. Instead of God's blessing, you feel stuck. And God feels far away. Well, that's exactly where Joseph found himself. Joseph had a dream, literally. He had a vision that he would be in a position of leadership, of influence, of authority and purpose. But instead of a straight line to success, his life took a detour into disaster. He's betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, wrongfully accused and thrown into prison. And if anyone had the right to say, God, what happened to the dream? It would have been Joseph. Everything in his life screamed that the dream was dead. But here's the thing. Just because a dream looks dead doesn't mean God is done. And that's where patience comes in. Today, we're continuing our Made for More sermon series on the fruit of the Spirit. And we're talking about patience. Not just the everyday kind of patience, right? Like, we're not just talking about the patience of waiting in the line at Walmart or dealing with slow drivers. Any of my road rage friends out there needing that kind of patience? We're not talking about that. We're talking about the kind of patience that trusts in God even when the waiting feels unbearable. And Joseph's story isn't just about dreams. It's about trusting God's timing when the dream feels impossible. It's about believing that God is still working, even when you can't see it. It's about holding on when everything in you wants to give up. Because sometimes the dream has to die before God resurrects it. And real patience means trusting that God is still writing the story. And so if you've ever felt stuck in the waiting, like the dream is gone, like God forgot about you, don't miss this today. Because the waiting isn't wasted. Patience isn't passive. It's an active trust that God's not done yet. And so I want to invite you to open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. If you're using the black seatback Bible in front of you, you can find it on page 26 in the Old Testament. And I really encourage everyone to open up a Bible, whether it's your own paper Bible or the seatback Bible, or even if you just want to open up Bible.com on your phone. You know, if you need big text size, that's okay. Go ahead and open up the Bible, because I'm going to be trying to put as much of it as I can on the screen, but we are going to be reading a lot of scripture today. And it's going to be going through Genesis 37 and the next couple chapters. This is the story of Joseph. And I'm assuming that most of us are familiar with the story of Joseph because it's one of the most dramatic stories in all of Scripture. It's been told and retold inside the church, outside the church. It got turned into a Broadway musical about a Technicolor Dreamcoat. I don't know if you saw it. But we're going to be reading almost all of Joseph's story because I'm positive that there are details in here that you either never knew or you forgot about. And I think God wants to teach us something about patience. I think he wants to teach us something about our perspectives on our pain, our journey, about how God's plan is still bigger than we could ever imagine. So we're going to start reading, and as we're reading, I want you to keep those Bibles open because we're going to be going through a lot of the text, but talking as we go. We pick up with Jacob, who's also called Israel. He's the grandson of Abraham, and he has 12 sons. And they become the 12 tribes of Israel. And his 11th son is Joseph. And Joseph is now 17 years old. And so we're going to start in Genesis chapter 37 with verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other children because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So we meet Joseph, our main character, who is unfairly favored by his father. And that brings jealousy and hate from his older brothers. And your Bible might have a note that says the phrase robe with long sleeves. It can also be translated coat of many colors. And that's how most of us maybe grew up hearing it, the coat of many colors. But scholars aren't quite sure what that means, whether it's literal or whether it's a metaphor. But it most likely refers to a manager's uniform, as opposed to someone who's a day laborer or working out in the fields. And so it's even more set to juxtapose. Joseph has been set up with influence and authority over his older brothers, and that's not winning him any brownie points at all. Once, Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." And his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed going to reign over us? Are you indeed going to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. See, Joseph starts off already disliked by his brothers. And then he has dreams which make it seem like he's going to be bowed down to by his whole family. But sharing those dreams just leads to more jealousy, more hate and anger and distrust. His brothers, they just want to knock him down a peg. It reminds me of the Japanese proverb, the nail that sticks up is the one that gets hammered down, right? And so the story continues. Joseph's dad, later on, the older brothers are out in the fields taking the flocks around, and Joseph's dad wants an update. So he sends Joseph, says, "Go talk to your brothers, get an update for me." And so Joseph, the 17-year-old manager, gets sent out to give a performance review for his older siblings. And they saw him from a distance. And before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of these pits. Then we'll say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what shall come of his dreams." I mean, I don't know about you, but that is some sibling rivalry, right? Like, the only answer to that is dang, okay? Because they hate his guts so much, they're plotting to kill him. But one brother, Reuben, says, no. Let's just haze him, okay? Let's throw him in one of these pits. And our text tells us, if you keep reading, Reuben planned to come back later and rescue him from the pit, take him back to dad. And we don't know if that's because he felt sorry for Joseph or if he's just trying to win brownie points with dad. But in either case, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. Now the pit was empty, there's no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite travelers passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. And so the brothers, they strip his robe off, they throw him in a pit, and then they get the bright idea to sell him to traveling merchants as a slave. I mean, these brothers really hated their little brother. They wanted to get rid of this kid. And now this isn't like some sibling rivalries that you might have in your family or like I have in my family, because these brothers, they grabbed this teenager. They probably beat him up. They ripped his manager's uniform off him that he got for being daddy's favorite guy. They throw him in a pit, and then they sell him, never to see him again, not caring if he'd be beaten, abused, die of mistreatment, whatever. And 20 pieces of silver wasn't even for lots of money. Now, scholars will tell us that this is between 1 to 2 years' salary. Now, 1 to 2 years' salary, that's a bit of money, but you split it up between 10 brothers. And each of them walked away with maybe a month's paycheck. Now, don't raise your hands, but some of you are thinking, I'd take that deal. Get rid of my kid brother for a month's paycheck? Absolutely. That sounds good to me. Don't out yourself, okay, if you're thinking that thought. All right, let's keep reading, okay? Now, they took Joseph's robe after this happened. They slaughtered a goat, and they dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it's your son's robe or not." And he recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." So now the brothers have gone past the point of no return. Joseph is gone. So they got to figure out a way to lie to dad. And so goat's blood and a ripped up robe do the trick. Jacob mourns the death of his favorite son. And he's probably thinking for the rest of his life that it was his fault he sent him out that day. Meanwhile, Joseph is being sold as a slave in Egypt 150 miles away from home. And so we're going to skip down to chapter 39. If you're reading along the paper Bible, skip down to 39. That picks up with the rest of Joseph's story. Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. He made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field, so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. The Lord was with Joseph. Even when it seemed like everyone else was against Joseph, God was with him. God never left him. God caused him to prosper. He blessed his work. The son, who had never done any menial labor in his life, is now a menial slave. But everything he puts his hands to, God blesses. And the master notices, gives him a little bit more responsibility, which Joseph handles well. He displays even more blessings from God. And so the master elevates him. But as it turns out, the master isn't the only one who has his eyes on Joseph. Now, Joseph was handsome and good looking. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. And he said to his master's wife, "Look, with me here, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my hand. He's not greater in this house than I am, and nor has he kept back anything from me except you, for you are his wife. How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" See, the master notices Joseph and wants to give him more responsibility, but the wife notices Joseph and wants to take him for herself. But Joseph, out of gratitude to his master, out of loyalty to his master, out of his faith in God, says no. Even after all this time, all the things that the brothers have done to him, he's still holding on to the faith of his childhood that he was raised with. But the wife won't take no for an answer. Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however, when he went into the house to do his work, and while no one else was in the house, she caught hold of his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called out to the members of her household and said to them, "See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And when he heard me raise my voice and cry out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Then she kept his garment by her until his master came home. And then she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to insult me, but as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and had fled outside. See, the wife doesn't take no for an answer, so she ends up trying to grab him, but only gets his robe. And then she calls in the servants. She makes a whole to-do about it and waits for her husband to get home so that she can cast Joseph as the villain. And when his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, this is the way your servant treated me, he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he remained there in prison. Now, I've just got to say, this husband has just heard that the slave boy took a pass at his wife and he didn't immediately have him executed. Like, either, probably both, God's favor totally protecting Joseph from being just murdered right then, and or the husband maybe not believing the story from the wife. I don't know, but in any case, Joseph gets thrown into prison. And we just need to recap for a second, because this favored son is hated by his brothers. And so they rip off his robe and they throw him in a pit, sparing him from being murdered. Then he's sold into slavery and he thinks his life is over. But he becomes the favored slave who prospers at what he does, and he demonstrates integrity. And he's desired by his master's wife. And so she rips off his robe and he's thrown in jail, being spared from being executed. And he is sitting there rotting in jail, thinking his life is over. And if I was Joseph, I would be so done with God. How could you let this happen to me? I was riding high. You gave me dreams of being in charge, but my brothers ruined it. Then I worked hard. I tried to turn things around. I did well, but then my master's wife ruined it. Where are you, God? How could you abandon me like this? If I was Joseph, that's how I would be feeling. But we keep reading. Then the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love. He gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And the chief jailer committed to Joseph's care all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The chief jailer paid no heed to anything that was in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. The favored son, who's hated by his brothers, has transformed into the favored slave, and now he's the favored prisoner. And this crazy roller coaster of a life, all the ups and downs, I think it shows us that it's not about our plan for our life. It's about God's presence that makes the difference. Patience isn't about waiting for God to give us our plan. Because every single one of us knows that all these ups and downs, this journey for Joseph, that was not his ideal plan for his life. This was not his ideal career path for his life. But God was with him. And he gave blessing to whatever he was doing, even in the middle of something that was not Joseph's plan. See, some of you listening today, you're struggling with patience because you're waiting for God to show up in the way that you expect. Some of you listening are struggling with patience because you're waiting for God to deliver your plan. But what if delay isn't the same thing as denial? What if God's plan is actually different than your plan? How are you going to respond? Are you going to respond with anger? Are you going to respond with fear? Maybe you respond with discontent? Or will you realize that it's not about our plan, it's about God's presence? Some of you need to hear the truth that, I went to the top, didn't I? Patience means trusting God even when life is unfair or unclear. Patience means trusting God even when life is unfair or unclear, because patience doesn't mean waiting for God to show up in our way or our timing. Patience means learning to trust God. And do you know what you get? when you grow in patience, when you let God grow patience in you? You might not get your plan, but when you allow God to grow patience in you, you always get more time with God, more opportunities to see him at work. We keep reading together. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker offended their lord, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in the custody, the house of the captain of the guard, the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he waited on them. They continued to for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined with him in prison, each his own dream, each dream with its own meaning. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. And so he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in the master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please, tell them to me." Joseph has been in prison for some time, and he's been entrusted with authority in the jail, right? He's not chained to some wall. He's been given autonomy to take care of tasks, to care for the other prisoners. And so we see Joseph is using his authority not to force anything on anyone. He's using his authority to serve others. And even at the end here, when he points to God as the source of interpretations, he's using his authority, he's using his servant heart to point to God. And then the cupbearer tells Joseph his dream, and the dream is all about being back with Pharaoh, giving him his drink. And so Joseph interprets that dream to mean that in 3 days, Pharaoh will call him back and reinstate him to his job. And Joseph asks the cupbearer, "Please, when you are back in your job, please remember me, put in a good word for me." And then the baker tells Joseph his dream, and it's all about birds eating food out of a basket on the baker's head. And Joseph interprets that dream to mean that in 3 days, Pharaoh will call him back, and he will have him hanged. Now, on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all of his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup in the Pharaoh's hand, but the chief baker he hanged, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And we keep reading in the next chapter, chapter 41. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that 2 whole years? I know I just said that patience is about trusting God even when life is unfair, but come on, 2 whole years? Joseph is definitely thinking he's been forgotten forever. It reminds me of this quote that I found. It's by Ernest Yabo. It says that time is the best teacher. Patience is the best lesson. And it seems like Joseph has been given tons of time in order to learn from God. And so after 2 years have passed, he's now wondering if the cupbearer has forgotten him forever. He's wondering if he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail. And that's when Pharaoh has a dream. And it's a crazy dream. It's all about fat cows getting eaten by skinny cows and fat ears of corn being swallowed up by skinny ears of corn. And Pharaoh wakes up really troubled. And so he calls all of his wise men, the sorcerers, the magicians, and he asks them to interpret his dream, tell them what the dream means, but they can't do it. No one can do it. And that's when the cupbearer all of a sudden goes, "Oh yeah, there was this guy in prison, totally interpreted my dream." And so he tells Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." And Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not I. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." And so we have Joseph pointing back to God's abilities instead of his own again. And then he proceeds to interpret Pharaoh's dream. He says, "The healthy cows and corn signify 7 years of an abundant harvest in the land. But the gaunt cows and corn signify 7 years of an extreme drought afterwards. And so Joseph suggests that Pharaoh collect the extra harvests for the next 7 years in order to store up enough food for the people to be able to survive the drought that comes after. And the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find anyone else like this, one in whom this is the Spirit of God?" So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand and arrayed him in garments of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, and had him ride in the chariot of his second in command. And they cried out in front of him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So we have Joseph going from the favored son who is a dreamer, and he gets attacked and sold by his brothers. Then he becomes the favored slave who's given responsibility, demonstrates integrity, but he gets slandered and thrown into prison. Then he becomes the favored prisoner who serves and interprets dreams, but he gets forgotten and left behind. But God was with Joseph in the waiting. And so he's called in to interpret Pharaoh's dream. And all those years of overseeing Potiphar's house as a slave, all those years of overseeing the jail and all the administration, serving those things, all of those years of serving become invaluable to Joseph to allow him to know how to give a plan for governing the entire land, ensure the safety of the people. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but all those things that Joseph went through absolutely formed him and shaped him for the thing that God was calling him to. And in turn, Pharaoh, he just lavishes all sorts of blessings on Joseph. If we keep reading, we see that Joseph is given power and authority and responsibility. He's given a wife. He has 2 kids. The first kid he names Forgetful, because God has given him so many joys that he can forget all the hardship that he's endured. The second kid is named Fruitful, because God has given him incredible blessings in the land of his misfortunes. See, we've seen that patience means trusting God even when life is unfair or unclear. But through this part, we've learned also that patience means being prepared by God for greater plans and purposes than we could have thought of. I've said it before, just because a dream looks dead doesn't mean that God is done. So what if the thing that feels like a setback is actually a setup? What if the delay isn't denial? What if God is still working behind the scenes even when you can't see it? Because the 17-year-old Joseph, with all of his dreams of authority, he couldn't have handled that authority. Now, our story doesn't say that God caused all those bad things to happen to him. It doesn't say God caused his brothers to do all those awful things to him, but God absolutely worked through those things and in spite of those things to bring about what Joseph was growing into. He didn't abandon him. God was with him in the waiting. God's presence in the pain is what grew Joseph's faith in God. It's what helped him grow in patience. See, we can see that growing in patience takes the focus off of us and points to God. It takes the focus off of our pain and it points us to God's plan. When you're in a dark season, it doesn't mean that God has abandoned you. It just means that your expectation of what was supposed to happen is different than what actually happened. But it's an invitation to press into God, to allow him to use the waiting to help you grow in patience. It's an invitation to spend time with God, to look for more ways that he is working in the waiting. Now, I do need to pause just for a second and give a quick pastoral note here, because we're seeing some incredible principles from the life of Joseph. But I need to tell you, you are not Joseph. Okay, so this story is the story of Joseph, and it isn't a metaphor for your life. These things that happened to Joseph are not promises that God is going to exalt you over your enemies. The story of Joseph shows us what God is like, that he is able to work through any circumstance to bring about his plan for redemptive love. And the story of Joseph isn't over yet. Now, when Jacob, Joseph's dad, learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you keep looking at one another? I have heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's younger brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he feared that harm might come to him. Thus, the sons of Israel were among the other people who came to buy grain, for the famine had reached the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land. It was he who sold it to the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. And when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. Well, they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Although Joseph had recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. And Joseph also remembered the dreams that he had dreamed about them. And he said to them, "You are spies. You've come to see the nakedness of the land." They said to him, No, my lord. Your servants have come to buy food. We're sons of one man and honest men. Your servants have never been spies." But he said to them, "No, you have come to see the nakedness of the land. No, we, your servants, were 12 brothers. We're the sons of a certain man in the land of Canaan, and the youngest, however, is now with her father, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It's just as I've said to you. You are spies, and here's how you shall be tested. As Pharaoh lives, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Let one of you go and bring your brother while the rest of you remain in prison, in order that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you, or else, as Pharaoh lives, surely you are spies." And he put them all together in prison for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this, and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here where you are imprisoned. The rest of you shall go and carry grain for the famine of your households. Bring your youngest brother to me. Thus your words will be verified, and you shall not die." And they agreed to do so. So Joseph, who has not seen his brothers in like 15 years, is now the one who's providing for them to survive the drought. But he wants to know if his 12th brother, the youngest brother, is being mistreated just like he was. And so he sends them all back, minus Simeon, with grain to feed their families, and he even secretly gives back all their money. And so he's making sure that all their families aren't starving, and he's doing it for free. And then there's this crazy exchange between the brothers who need to convince the dad to release Benjamin in order for them to go spring Simeon, because he's still imprisoned back in Egypt. But Jacob is afraid and won't allow it. He's lost one son already, and he's afraid that he's going to lose his youngest. But time passes, they run out of grain again, and finally they have to convince him to let them bring Benjamin with them for the second trip to Egypt to get food. And this time, they bring double the money because they thought the free food was a mistake, and so they show up and they try to pay extra, but Joseph's main servant, the steward, says, No, you're good. Come in, dinner's all ready. And so they come in, they have dinner with Joseph, and Joseph sets them up in order from oldest to youngest, which blows their mind because they never told him who was oldest and who was youngest. And then Joseph devises this whole plan to frame Benjamin with stealing a silver cup. And so he sends them off with all their grain and all the food. Okay, yeah, come back and buy some more later. But a silver cup has been hidden in Benjamin's stuff. So after they left, all the guards, they come up and they chase him down, and they make this whole show of discovering the silver cup. And he stole from our master, so we've got to kidnap him, bring him back. And they take him back as a prisoner to Joseph. And the brothers are just freaking out because if they go home without Benjamin, their father will literally die from grief. And so they go back and they plead for Benjamin's release. And I think that Joseph is either trying to spend some extra time with the kid brother that he never got to know, or he's testing his older brothers to see if they've changed. Are they just going to leave their kid brother again like they left me? But in any case, they come back, they plead with Joseph, and Joseph can't take it anymore. And he breaks down and he tells them who he is. And at first they don't believe him. They are flabbergasted, but he's hugging them and he's crying and he's asking about his father. Is my father alive? And so then Pharaoh hears that Joseph's family is there. And at first he's like, we're going to give them all the food. Then he says, better yet, bring your family here, relocate and live here in Egypt. You will live here and be honored among all the people because Joseph is the one who has made sure that our people are fed and that our nation remains strong even during this drought. And so all the 12 brothers and their father and their families, they all relocate to Egypt together. And it's all because Joseph was given authority over all Egypt. He's rescued the whole country. He's rescued his whole family, all because of how God was working through the circumstances. And then we get to the end of the story, and it's got this incredible part in chapter 50. Joseph's dad has died. And then the brothers freak out because they think, well, now Joseph is finally going to get his revenge on us. So they come to him to beg for mercy, and this is what he says. Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, and in order to preserve a numerous people, as he's doing today. Even though you intended me harm, God intended it for good. See, there's no way that Joseph had any of these plans when he was younger. Right? How many of us, when we were 17, had planned out our whole life? For those of you who are over 17, did you plan all the ups and downs? Did you plan all the changes and transitions that you've experienced? Did you plan all the heartache and loss that you've endured? Did you know how God would work through all of that to bring you to where you are now to accomplish his plans? Because when we are focused too much on our plan, on our timing, when we're focused too much on our hopes that aren't being met, we experience a lack of peace, a lack of patience. But when we focus on God's presence, he grows patience in us. And patience helps us learn to trust God's timing and plan. See, Joseph didn't know how it all turned out. When he was in the pit, when he was in prison, when he was waiting year after year after year, he had no idea what God was doing behind the scenes. But now, looking back, he can say with confidence, what you intended for harm, God intended for good. And the same is true of you. You might not see it yet. You might still be in the waiting. But God is working in the waiting. And even better than that, God is with you in the waiting. And so maybe today, instead of demanding answers, maybe you just need to rest in God's presence. Maybe instead of rushing ahead, you need to trust God's timing. Because when we focus on our plan, our timing, our pain, we lose peace. But when we focus on God's presence, he gives us patience. And patience is how we learn to trust the God who never wastes a season. And because of the Spirit of God at work in us, because of the work of Jesus giving us his life and resurrection, we get to hold on. We get to stay faithful. God is not done writing our story. Isn't that good news? Amen.